welcome to Tittie Tattles.
This is Sydney and Phoebe joining you from Taipei and London to gossip about movies, pop culture, and social issues from the perspective of two cosmopolitan Asian girls.
We met in university and have both studied abroad in the West. This podcast is about having relaxed conversations, respectfully debating the controversial, exploring cultural nuances, and having fun while doing it.
So sit back and pour yourself a martini.
Or a glass of whiskey.
Or your whole minibar while we bring you some Prado.
With a lot of giggles. Okay, so for this episode, Phoebe and I decided to talk about Gilmore Girls. I personally think that this is one of those TV shows that still seem oddly relatable and perhaps relevant to many viewers despite it being 2 decades old, because it started in like 2000, right?
Wow.
So, yeah, 2000. So when Phoebe told me that she had started to dip into the Gilmore Girls universe, I was very excited because this was the show that I grew up with during my tweens. And it is one of the top 3 shows that I always revisit if I need something feel-good to binge on. Naturally, we spent hours texting and chatting on the phone, comparing notes and reactions towards the show, and it turned out that we had very different reactions towards it, partly because Phoebe wasn't watching it as a teenager, and I had already watched it way too many times for the past couple of years.
So we thought, why not talk about it on the podcast? I'm sure there are many listeners out there who grew up with it, like Sydney, and also many who are just discovering it, like me, since Netflix recently added the revival, but I haven't watched that one yet, so no spoilers. And I'm so glad to have someone to rant with as I go through this show. There's a lot of rant material. And it turns out that we have really different views on a lot of plot points, so it's going to make an interesting discussion.
Yeah, so today we're going to go through some themes that we generally found interesting to talk about, and we also actually picked an episode to watch together, and we're going to go through a little bit of that to see how we react initially when we enjoyed that episode together. So, Phoebe, you want to go first?
Yeah, so the first thing that struck me when I started watching this show was it felt like a piece of the puzzle falling into place about Sydney's personality and backstory. Like, you could be a walking advertisement for the show. After I watched it, I was like, aha. I feel like watching this show growing up, you kind of absorbed many aspects of Lorelai's personality and her philosophy in life. And isn't it amazing how literature and movies can do that to you?
Yes, it is. And it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've built my personality on many great works of literature and also a lot of fanfic. We both grew up in Asia, and what made us kind of westernized before we studied abroad at university was the Western literature that we consumed during our formative years. So how do you feel like Gilmore Girls influenced you in life from watching it?
You mean as opposed to the stuff you already see? Let's see.
I mean, I feel like I see the superficial stuff, like you talking very fast, like Lorelai.
Well, it's exhilarating to do that, but okay. So to talk about the less superficial stuff, I think it helped me cope with my relationship with my mother. For those who don't already know this, Gilmore Girls talks about Lorelai's relationship with her daughter Rory, and her own relationship with her mother Emily. So I feel like this show, for me, watching as an Asian, it is a hybrid of both Eastern and Western influences, because Lorelai and Emily has a very like a typical Asian mom versus rebellious offsprings type of dynamic going on. But I think Lorelai was able to approach her own relationship with her daughter in a different way as she grew up and got older. Yeah, so being able to see how Lorelai handled both relationships helped me realize the nuances, all the gray areas of a mother-daughter relationship, which is always complex by default, and it helped me learn how to nurture a closer relationship with my mother. Another part of the show is that the romantic relationships featured in the show actually resonated pretty well with my quest, or multiple quests, to find love. Phoebe knows all about them. Rory is much more relatable to Asians as compared to Lane. I feel like Lane actually speaks to Asian Americans because they have the more conservative and traditional parent, like Mrs. Kim. So I think that aspect of it is probably relatable to another crowd. But as an Asian, Rory's character is actually easier to relate to for me. Because I grew up in Asia. And this is because Rory takes her future and privilege very seriously, and she makes efforts to play things safe in many aspects of her life. So her choices of boyfriends have gone from the safer options, the rebellious options, and perhaps more practical options throughout the show. I've definitely had my fair share of Deans, Jesses, and Logans in my life. And it's actually very eerie and also weirdly cathartic to revisit her relationship developments from the perspective as an adult. So yeah, it's really, I'm like rewatching this with Phoebe and I'm like, what was I thinking? But yeah, so how about you, Phoebe? Are there aspects of romantic or non-romantic relationships that appeal to you because of your Asian upbringing in this show?
Yeah, I think I also relate to Rory a lot because she reminds me of myself at that age. And I agree with what you said about Lane because she's the actual Asian in this show, but she's a lot more rebellious than most of us are with the leaving home and being in a rock band.
Yeah, I don't think we were ever primed or influenced enough by Western culture to actually execute that type of behavior. We always looked up to it, but it was like, yeah, it's cool, but you know, I got my grades and my mom's yelling. And, you know,
we are total Rorys. We're sitting here thinking about going to Yale and reading books and being not very popular at school.
Also, a side note is that I remember we reacted really differently to a lot of the things, right, in the show, especially with the relationship aspects. Do you think you could dwell on that more?
Yeah, I think I too had my Deans, Jesses, and Logans. And what struck me was I'm impressed at how well Lorelai is at being both Rory's friend and her mother and supporting her through her good decisions and bad decisions. I think very few Asian parents can be so open-minded. My mom is still mad about my Jesses.
My mom doesn't really care if I date Jesses. She's more, I think she had a stronger opinion to how I reacted to any relationship. She was more focusing on me than the men in the earlier stages of my life. And then later on did we start to focus on what was wrong with the problematic men that I was dating at that time.
Yeah. My mom, no. My mom's a lot more conservative than that.
How about Lorelai's own romantic relationships? What do you think?
Well, I feel like I liked the backup love interest a lot more than you did. I liked Lorelai with Max and I liked Lorelai with Jason. And I wasn't actually so keen on Lorelai and Luke at first, but now I'm getting to the part where they actually do it. But I like how they've written it so far. I like that Luke went through the emotional development to get there. But Lorelai as well, I think she needed to do a lot of emotional development before she could get to a happily ever after in her life, regardless of who the man was. And because she had Rory so young, she was basically married to Rory for the whole of her adult life. And that influenced her dating of men so much.
I think the idea of married to your children is also a very like relatable aspect of like Asian parenting and Asian relationships with their
Definitely.
Parents. Yeah. Yeah, so I feel like there's so many elements in this show that we can relate to with an Asian upbringing and so forth. But like you said, I really didn't like the other like supporting dating guys that weren't the main meal, the main course.
They were cute. Max was very attractive.
And it was boring.
Yeah, but they had this whole sexual chemistry thing going on.
He was our teacher. It was weird. No, not that I was judging. I really didn't like Jason. I feel like he had all the wrong intentions. I feel like he prioritized his own needs first, not in the not in a sense where you think it's a healthy relationship, or in a sense where like I feel like Jason has this ego that he needs to fulfill, maybe because of his upbringing, his relationship with his parents. But from my perspective, I never felt like he loved Lorelai enough to make a compromise in that sense. And and that was a big issue with the other guys as well. But we can talk about a little bit of that later or in the next episode or so.
Really? I like Jason fine. I think he was considering of Lorelai's needs in some episodes. Like in the first date, he didn't realize that she wouldn't like the separate room. So they ended up being at a supermarket and that seemed to work out for them. He wasn't too snobby to go to a supermarket. I think it's an adult relationship thing to be more aware of your own needs. You have to love yourself first before you love other people.
I agree with that. I just don't think Jason, let's put it this way. I don't think Jason loved Lorelai for being Lorelai. And it's unfair to all of Lorelai's past like relationships because none of them saw Lorelai in the full dimensions that she had created her personality around, because they saw like the rebellious girl who went against Emily and Richard and said no to the elite life that they provided for her. But I think they saw the cool, fun side of that, but they weren't really prepared to see the Stars Hollow version of Lorelai that struggled.
But I think that was deliberate on Lorelai's side as well, that she consciously or unconsciously didn't want them in that part of her life. And with Max, when he wanted to become part of Rory's life, she was like, no, I've already raised Rory, stay out. You're just here to look pretty.
I find that a fair point. But just because I feel like it's different for me and you, because you're seeing this from like, I'd say, because you're seeing this as an adult, and I got attached to this show when I was like growing up, like my own like teenage young adult personality was developing, and so I feel very protective towards Lorelai, and so like all of the guys she's dating, like I keep saying no to the ones that I don't like, and so I feel like it's normal that we're reacting differently.
So Lorelai is the main person that you relate to in the show.
I think in terms of core values, yes. In terms of like behavior and how would you, in terms of how I grew up, I feel like Rory has that trajectory that I relate to, but in terms of like values that I look up to and that I genuinely agree with, it's Lorelai.
I'm different. I think I relate mostly to Rory. I think I'm watching 80% from the perspective of Rory, and then I like Lorelai. I relate to her in some points, especially in dealing with her family, because overbearing Asian parents. And I like her point of view on some things, but I also don't agree with her on a lot. But I get more worked up when Rory does something I don't like, because Rory is me when I'm watching. I'm like, why are you doing that? That's stupid.
But didn't we all do stupid things? When we were kind of little Rorys running around on campus.
Yeah, but it's like when you're sitting there watching a reel of yourself from 5 years ago thinking, why was I so stupid? Snap out of it.
I think that's really interesting, because like I definitely relate to both of them. But I think for me, the defining difference is because I see Lorelai is someone that's a grown up that's still kind of growing up. And I find something very appealing about that. I find her independence appealing. I think the fact that Rory was also always so passive was something that I was trying to reject, maybe because part of it was also some like part of my personality, the passive part.
I'm at the part where Rory is in sophomore year now, and I'm also very impatient for her to do some development and not be so much of a prim and proper little kid now. It's about time, Rory, do something.
I know, and I love how Lorelai takes charge, because there is that part of me. So I guess maybe I'm more of a mixture of both, which is why you see so much of a Lorelai influence on me, I think, maybe.
Your personality manifests more in a Lorelai sort of way.
Yes, I try to reject the Rory side of me, because there are parts of her I really just don't enjoy, but we can talk about that another time.
That makes sense.
Yes, but circling back to the question about like the relationships that we enjoyed and didn't enjoy, I think like one point I'd like to make is that for Lorelai, I always felt that it was going to be Luke, because yes, I agree that Max was charming, and yes, who hasn't had that, date your teacher or date your kid's teacher, however that manifests type of fantasy. I mean, it was hot. It was really hot. And he was in that perfect middle ground where he wasn't completely elite. He wasn't doing business with her parents. He wasn't inheriting a family fortune. He was a well brought up intellectual that was kind and gentle and loving. So he was in that middle point. He was part of the Hartford circle, the Emily and Richard Gilmore circle. And he was, because he was in the middle ground, he was able to relate more to Lorelai. But fundamentally, he was still part of an external world that didn't really fit in with Stars Hollow. That was the same thing with Christopher and Jason and whoever Lorelai was dating. But I feel like for Luke, it was easier for me to like him more, because as an Asian, we're not taught to seek for the romance in a marriage or in a relationship. We're always asked to seek for practicality or compromise. And there's this term that we call 门当户对, which roughly translates to finding a practical match in a socioeconomic sense, because the doors and the families and whatever, it all matches. Yes.
But isn't that more about your parents and your family background?
Yes. I feel like from an old, like a time in the past, that would have been something that Lorelai would have to consider. And I would have to consider it. But I think like for today, we are taught about like finding someone that matches you in the more practical sense. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to marry rich or marry someone as rich as you. That should be something you concern. But I don't think as an Asian, my upbringing was about find someone that you love, find someone that you're passionate about. That was never the case. It was always about finding someone that
I
can
think that's
work
one of
with
the
you.
key differences in how we approach romantic relationships in Asia and in the West.
Yes, definitely.
We don't romanticize love as much.
We don't. And so Luke fits that criteria. He is the person that's always there for her. He also has been there for Rory. He didn't have to insert himself in his life. And he tries to profess his affection towards Lorelai through very practical actions. I mean, granted that he does do something a little bit over the top sometimes, but he doesn't do it by talking about it. He just goes for it, and he works with her, you know?
Yeah. And he already knows all of her flaws and her background because they've known each other for so many years.
Yes. But like, I definitely agree that if we wanted to come back to the traditional understanding of 门当户对, then Luke would never have been able to pass the Gilmore test with Emily and Richard.
No, that's what's causing all the conflict, right? Because they think that nobody's good enough for our daughter because we're such a notable family. But the reality is that Lorelai does make sense with Luke. She's a small business owner. He's a small business owner. They both, I think Luke finished high school. Lorelai didn't even finish high school, but they're both really smart people, smart, practical, works hard. And he has a lot to teach her as well. But the Gilmores just look down on him because he isn't college educated and he drives a truck and he owns a diner. My parents too would flip out if I told them I was dating a guy, high school educated and owns a diner. They'd be like,
oh yeah. I feel like my parents weren't like that in the beginning, but I think they did drop hints. I don't think they were trying to be snobbish though. I think it came back to the practical sense because like I definitely experienced situations where because of my upbringing, because of my understanding of how to spend money, how to enjoy life was so different from the guys that I was dating, that was also a source of conflict. Even though we liked each other, we loved each other, we wanted to make it work, those little sparks of conflict really made it hard to sustain like the healthy aspects of the relationship. And so my parents have definitely dropped in some like foods of thought telling me like, you know, we don't need you to marry rich or someone, you know, like our social economic background. That's fine. But you should know that if you do see the value of things in both like in a monetary sense, in a different way, then it would really hurt your relationship because that's a lot to work on.
Yeah, that makes sense. But you know what really bugs me about Lorelai and Luke? That it took them so long to get there, and Luke had other relationships that could totally have worked out if Lorelai wasn't such a green tea bitch. Do we need to explain the concept of a green tea bitch?
I think it's called 绿茶 green tea 婊, which is what we call bitch. And I think, from my understanding, it is what women who are very sweet and fresh and nice on the outside, but deep down, they're judgmental, they're bitchy, and they drop some pretty nasty bombs in other people's lives very subtly.
And they steal your boyfriend without actively stealing your boyfriend. They're just there and being nice and understanding, which was what Lorelai basically did. Every time there was a problem in Luke's other relationships, she was just like, oh, how could she do that to you? Don't move in with her. Why would she make you move out of Stars Hollow?
Well,
and she
I don't know.
Even trying.
I mean, I can't. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but knowing how they kind of feel for each other, I would say it's human nature. I think green tea bitch or any type of bitch. I mean, there's definitely like a moral ground where like there's a bottom line to what you can do, what you wouldn't do. But reactions like Lorelai's, I would put in the gray area where like, you know, it depends on the context. It depends on what's really going on in your mind. And I think what Lorelai had to work through at that time, what she did fail to do was that she wasn't responsible for her own feelings, her own struggles, and her own denial.
Yeah, she was definitely in denial about liking Luke and then acting on the basis of those subconscious feelings. I think ideally you want to be emotionally mature enough to not do that. But then again, if she was, they wouldn't have ended up together.
Yeah, so speaking of like immature reactions to relationships, I feel like Rory has her fair share of like questionable choices.
Yeah, like the thing with Dean.
Yes, I'm going to start with my favorite pick, and I'm going to say this. I'm going to say for Yale, for her time in Yale, because you haven't seen the later parts of the show and the renewal ones.
Sure.
So for Rory and Yale, I definitely prefer Logan mainly because he gave her another option. She didn't have to do what Lorelai did. She had a chance to discover what she liked or disliked about the world Logan and her grandparents were in. So he taught her how to handle this privilege, not necessarily in the healthiest way, but he gave her a key. And that Emily and Richard failed to do. And she, I mean, in a sense, I feel like Rory was always meant to have to, like, you know, balance the worlds between her mother Star's hollow world and her grandparents' world. And I think Logan was a very good segue into dealing that. And I think he loved her. Especially in the end, which I'm not going to talk about right now because we want Phoebe to enjoy that herself.
No, I don't know things.
Yes, but to be fair,
I've only seen the start of their relationship.
Speaking of the start, Marty, I think by the point where you are in the show, professed his love for Rory, and she friend zoned him, right?
Yeah,
to be fair. To be fair, I think, like, from an Asian perspective, I think Marty and Dean would have been typical options for Asian women. I think Dean is because he's a nice kid, and at the time of their courtship, he was an emotionally stable guy. He was a safe bet. At the time. Yeah, he kind of turned out quite awful later in the series. Marty, for Marty, I think it's because in Asian culture, not necessarily Asian American culture, I think friend zoning means you still have a chance, because in Asian culture, when we approach relationships, there's never a clear distinction
we're not so
between
straightforward
dating.
About things. We're not like, so what are we?
Yes, we actually, I think we are in that sense. Like, for us, like, a relationship is the status of a relationship is not solidified until you say, I like you, shall we officially make ourselves boyfriend and girlfriend. Before that, there is this long tango of trying to hang out with someone, very passively flirting and trying to create situations where you can spend more time with that person or profess your affection.
And we still hold to that whole concept of chasing a girl. So if you're in the friend zone, you're like, okay, now I chase you.
Yes, now I chase you. And so because we have to have that, like, moment of, like, you know, that decision making, like, are we a couple or not? And as in, like, America, it's more like, or any Western culture, I think it's more like we can date, but whether we make that into something that we acknowledge publicly or take more seriously, that's the next step. But for Asians, anything before you publicly acknowledge that you are an official couple is called we're friends. And
exactly.
So in Marty's sense, had he tried harder to sustain his relationship with Rory and, like, sucked up his pride in an Asian sense, I'm not saying that he should have done that. I'm saying, like, from an Asian perspective, if he had went on with that, then he could have easily probably been able to do more to prove his worth, his value, and he could have easily, like, done something, say that if Rory and Logan ever had a fight or something, he would have been able to
be there for her, be the shoulder to cry on, and then your eyes meet.
Yes, because that's how Dean got his chance, right? He was a shoulder to cry on, and then Rory kind of was able to rekindle her feelings for him.
True.
So trust us. In Asian culture, you wait long enough, you actually might get something. Not necessarily a wedding ring, but you might get something at some point.
Yeah. Dean and Marty are very Asian good boys. I know of many Deans and Martys.
I have had my share of Deans and Martys, and they have been sweet, but part of being an adult is knowing that what you want is a little bit different. And I feel like that's why we can both relate to Rory as well. We've been through that stage where we fit the Asian archetype of, like, you know, the nice girl who plays, like, the safe choices in terms of relationship. And then we sort of morph on to, like, the rebellious ones, and then we learn our lessons, and we end up being with more responsible and healthy relationships.
Yeah, so I'm totally with you on Logan. I love that part about him making her jump off the building. But we disagree about Jess. I like Jess, but that's because I finished the whole series. Yeah, I assume he comes back at some point a changed man and makes up for the shitty things he did, like disappearing without a thought. And, you know, he just wasn't a really good boyfriend at all. He didn't consider Rory's needs. He was selfish.
Yes. But later on, he does change. And what he does with that change is for you to find out.
Mysterious.
So to move on to the second part of our podcast, we decided that it would be more interesting if we sat in and watched an episode together and nitpick through the things that we thought was interesting and react to it. So because at that time when we watched that episode together, we were on you were about to start season 4, episode 1.
Yeah, season 4 is a good turning point when Rory is finishing high school.
Yeah, so they come back from Europe and Rory messes up the orientation date for Yale. And they go through a hectic couple of days trying to go through every errand and ritual before Rory goes up to college.
Yeah.
Would you like to start?
Right. So season 4, episode 1, not a very words, not one where a big change happens, no big bombs dropped, but it does kind of show some of the overall themes of the show. Like the first thing that they did was they came back from their holiday and they brought back souvenirs for everyone, which is very cute. And I thought that's a very relatable thing for Asians to do. I remember trying to find these trashy little fridge magnets and stuff for my relatives and my friends back home whenever I went on holiday. So their circle in Stars Hollow is a lot like these close-knit family, friends, and social circles we have in Asia as well.
I think like in my parents' generation, that would have been something done a lot. And I think it was because at that time, people didn't really get to travel as much. Knowing that Lorelai and Rory, well, the whole Gilmore Girls world started in 2000 and went on to 2007. That was still kind of when less people had like cheaper options to travel. So I feel like that would have been a good reason to bring back souvenirs. As of today, I've been told that, since everybody kind of gets to travel somewhere, it's not really necessary to always bring something because it's financially draining if you have to think of every single person, and it's kind of pointless because you end up getting really trashy stuff if you want to stay on budget.
Yeah. And when you think about it, those stupid travel souvenirs don't mean anything to people who haven't been there.
No. And so what I do now is that for people that I'm very close with or people who have this like other connection with this place, like say that I stop by a bookstore and I find something that one of my friends would definitely enjoy, then I might purchase that. But I don't go on like trying to purchase things that will just make someone smile for like 5 seconds. Like, you thought of me. Haha, hello, crappy Eiffel Tower necklace or keychain. What do I do with this?
The classic Eiffel Tower keychain. I think I have one, probably more than one. But don't you think that Gilmore Girls paints a very rosy picture of this small town dynamic? They're like thinking of them, bringing them gifts. Yes. In my opinion and experience, these small town dynamics are way bitchier.
Yeah, But I think it's also because it's so relatable to like the Asian or like Hua people social dynamic. Because we're so intrusive about other people's business. And I think the small town thing was very exhilarating to watch because it was like, oh my God, I can relate to that totally. Because that's every day. You don't have to be in a small town. You just have to have enough people in your family for it to stir drama. Yeah, enough nosy people in your family to stir drama or pass on judgment or critique that is unsolicited.
Yeah, and there's always going to be the gossipy ones, the Miss Patties and the Taylors who are drunk on like their 2 cents of power. And
so annoying.
Kirks. Everyone bullies Kirk.
Yeah, everyone bullies Kirk. That I find problematic, but we can talk about that next time because there's actually a lot of things that I think were interesting to reflect on in terms of like the difference between Asians or Western culture that were either eerily similar or kind of different.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But I think the good thing about Gilmore Girls and the Stars Hollow community was that I think they were genuinely supportive. They had their differences. There was a lot of drama, but I think they were supportive. And I don't think there was a lot of like petty competition going on.
Yeah, like they had their arguments, but on the whole circle is very sweet. It's what you would hope your social circle is like.
But I don't think that's very true with Asian like relative or like the whole like that culture where our relatives or our social circle feel like they have the right to pry. Because I've definitely received very nasty comments from people who thought they were close or who were like people who knew my parents. Like one of the examples was when I got into high school. I got into like an okay high school. It wasn't very bad. It was a public school, which is considered really good in Taiwan. I just wasn't in the top 3 schools. And then one of their, because my parents are teachers, and one of the parents that they knew, they asked my parents, "Oh, which school did your daughter get into?" And they told them the name of my school, and they're like, "What kind of like small, like insignificant school is that? Oh my God!" And I was like,
Wow.
Who gave you the right to judge? Like, it's so rude. And I feel like you don't see that in Star Tall. The whole everybody's nosy and gossipy thing is there, but I feel like at least in the world of this universe, people are genuinely nice. Like, they're just nosy, which is human nature. Gossip is human nature.
Yeah, they're like nosy, but not so judgy. They only stray very slightly into the judgy territory. Like when the Lorelai Luke breakup happened, they were handing out ribbons. Taylor.
Well, I feel like Taylor is judgy, but he's judgy in a sense where like you empathize with him just because you know how insecure he is about everything.
Because he is so insecure about not being important, he has to puff himself up about being important.
Yes. Yeah, it's funny in the name of entertainment. In real life, he would probably be a very toxic neighbor.
Very.
Wow. So this has been a very fun conversation with you. I think I really enjoy the fact that because you started to talk about Gilmore Girls and that you brought such a fresh point of view to the way you reacted to everything, because you didn't start it from your teenage years, you started from now as like a grown adult. And so I was kind of like forced to rethink everything. And then I realized that there were a lot of things that I could relate to in different sense, and a lot of things that I agree with you and I disapproved. And I'm very excited what you're going to find out later on when you continue with the series.
Yeah, I know. I still have a season and a half to go, plus the revival. So thank you for doing your best to keep in the spoilers.
It's really hard.
I'm very excited to find out what happens. I love that the characters in Gilmore Girls are so real and relatable, and they're not perfect, but their imperfections make sense. And I don't think I've ever been so invested in sitcom characters before. I mean, there are great sitcoms that I watched before, like, Friends, How I Met Your Mother, and they have their relationships and everything, but I wasn't as invested as in this, I guess, because we relate to it more. It's just... I
definitely, it's easy to relate to them because I think what Gilmore Girls does is that it gives you like a very sharp view of different hierarchies in the New England culture. And because there's so much exposition, witty banter, and cultural phenomenon drops in there, that you're given this very complete and vivacious like database to like dive into and find something that you can relate to. So it's a very I wouldn't say diverse in like today if we're trying to be very politically correct about everything, but I feel like in sense of like the material that they offer to an international audience as us is very rich and diverse. And that's
I don't think they realized how relatable they are to Asians.
No, I don't think so at all. I felt like they probably thought by dropping Lane and Mrs. Kim in it was their token Asian thing.
Yeah.
But they had no idea how much everything else actually related to us so much,
Definitely. And it's so cool that it's a show about the relationship between mother and daughter, because usually shows are very focused on romantic relationships. And while Gilmore Girls has plenty of that, the key chain that ties everything together is the Gilmore family. And, any girl can relate to that.
Yeah. Well, this was definitely a very fruitful conversation, and we're definitely planning to reapproach this topic once Phoebe gets through the rest of the season, and hopefully the additional bonus episodes that they did a couple years ago. And so hopefully by next time when we approach this topic, we can look at things from a broader sense. So stay tuned for our second GG reaction on Tittie Tattles.
Yep, definitely. Hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for our other episodes reacting to popular shows and movies from an Asian girl perspective. And see you next time.
Bye.